Hi, everyone. My name's John Nauright, and I'm from the University of Sydney in Australia, coming to you in Sarah Zip's class to talk about sport in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I started my academic career teaching in Dunedin, New Zealand, in the South Island in the 1990s. And while I was there, I did a lot of research on sport in New Zealand, which sports were the most popular, and why certain sports came to dominate in New Zealand. For men, the dominant sport since the 19th century has been rugby. And many of you have probably seen the haka. If not, I hope Sarah shows it to you today. Performed by the New Zealand All Blacks rugby team, the national men's rugby team, or by the New Zealand Black Ferns, the women's national rugby team, before and occasionally after matches, such as when the Black Ferns won the Women's World Cup in 2022. And I know Sarah was lucky enough to be there at the final to see the last gasp win over England. Rugby was largely a men's game, played in the private schools of New Zealand, and it was used to kind of forge a colonial elite. Rugby arrived in New Zealand in the 1870s and began to be played at the elite schools. And as early as 1888, there was a tour of the British Isles by what was then called a Maori team. Maori refers to the indigenous people, the original inhabitants of New Zealand, who called the country Aotearoa, which means land of the long white cloud. Pakeha, or white people, and New Zealand is the only place in the world where the indigenous name for white people is the dominant name. Pakeha New Zealanders began to play rugby in large numbers, but this 1888 tour was marketed as a Maori tour to England. They played a number of matches, and people in England could see how well New Zealand rugby was developing. Then in 1905, the first official All Blacks tour to England took place at a time when New Zealand had just refused to join Australia as one country and decided to become their own country. And the 1905 All Blacks beat England, the home of rugby in the British Empire in those days, and beat France and beat Scotland, and narrowly lost to Wales, the only match they lost on that tour. And it really put rugby on the map, both in terms of the New Zealand government, who saw it as a way to promote nationalism, and from the British, who saw just how successful New Zealand could be in rugby. Then throughout the 20th century, New Zealand, alongside South Africa, became the dominant rugby playing countries in the world. For women, rugby was seen in those days to be too rough and too dangerous. Although if you've ever been in a rugby scrum, and maybe some of you do play rugby, you know that it's the male genitals that hang loose and expose themselves as opposed to women. But in those days, they thought that rugby was too rough. And there was a new sport in the 1890s called basketball that had been invented by Canadian James Naismith in Massachusetts. And a number of English women and New Zealand and Australian physical educators thought that netball, a modified version of basketball, would be a good sport for women. And it developed rapidly, and New Zealand formed some of the earliest provincial organizations. Netball was played in New Zealand by 1902, and it became the sport for women, controlled by women, to the point that there was even in the constitution of Netball New Zealand, then the New Zealand Basketball Association originally, that only women could hold offices in the sport. So those two became, rugby for men and netball for women, the dominant sports for men and women in New Zealand, both for Maori women and men, and for Maori and Pakeha women and men in rugby. Indeed, the first captain of the New Zealand national netball team that played against Australia was Meg Matangi, who was a Maori New Zealander. The top rugby player for New Zealand in the 1920s was George Nepia, who was also a Maori New Zealander. So you can see that rugby was fairly integrative. The only time Maoris didn't play rugby for New Zealand was when they played South Africa, because South Africa had the policy of segregation and then apartheid, where they did not allow Black people or brown people to play with whites. And so New Zealand kind of capitulated to that until protest emerged in the 1960s to fight against apartheid. And in 1967, the New Zealand government canceled a tour to South Africa, which led to the South African government making its first concession on race to allow Maori New Zealanders to come in as honorary whites. And this was the first crack of any kind in apartheid policy. And so rugby was so important to white South Africans that they were willing to make concessions. Some people thought this wasn't enough. And in 1981, there was a national civil war over the South African rugby team coming to New Zealand to play. So there were, the first match was canceled because somebody threatened to fly a plane into the stadium. And the third and last test match, another pilot dropped flour bombs, bags of flour onto the field. Protesters were tear gassed by the police, massive disruption, which coincided with, in 1982, New Zealand's soccer team, the All Whites, were qualified for the World Cup of Soccer. And so a number of parents, thinking rugby was violent, too political, encouraged their kids into soccer. And so soccer began to grow in New Zealand as well. New Zealand also has a long history in the Olympic Games, competing originally as an Australasian team with Australia, and then from 1908 onward as their own team. They've won a number of medals, and they're particularly successful in track and field, in rowing, swimming, and sailing. New Zealand is probably the only place in the world where sailing is a compulsory subject in physical education. So those are some of the main markers. And then also New Zealand is known for outdoor and adventure sports, going back to when Sir Edmund Hillary was the first Westerner to climb Mount Everest in 1954. So you can see that New Zealand has a rich legacy. They're also strong in field hockey, in rugby league football, which is a different code from rugby union, which is 13-a-side as opposed to 15-a-side, where New Zealand is one of the top 3 countries in the world. They also have a national basketball team, ice hockey team, and other teams, all similarly branded. So the men's rugby team is the All Blacks. The basketball team are the Tall Blacks. The ice hockey team are the Ice Blacks. The women's rugby team are the Black Ferns. The Black Caps are the national cricket team. And you can see that there's a black or a fern. The Silver Ferns are the national netball team. So there's a lot of similar branding. And most noticeably, you'll recognize a New Zealander or somebody who supports New Zealand by the silver fern on a black jersey or a black shirt. So those are some of the highlights of sport in Aotearoa, New Zealand. They compete in trans-Tasman Sea leagues with Australian teams in professional basketball, professional netball, professional rugby union, and professional rugby league. So there's also a very close interaction between top-level New Zealand sport and top-level Australian sport. A lot like professional leagues in North America have Canadian teams playing in leagues that are predominantly from the United States. So hopefully that's given you a little overview of sport in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I'm sure that Sarah can fill in the gaps that may have been missed. And I've enjoyed talking to you, and I hope you have a great rest of your semester. Thank you.